Do you know where your family came from? How far back in your family tree can you go before you stop being able to tell stories of your ancestors? History is important, and it's important to pass down to our kids because it reminds us of who we are, and it reminds us of the things that have shaped our lives as we lived them. History is what people will be thinking about and talking about when they look back upon our own legacies. In ancient times, histories were related through stories around a campfire, or they were painted on walls in caves. Eventually, with the invention of alphabets, those accounts were able to be preserved in written forms and then passed down from generation to generation. Today, we continue to tell stories around the dinner tables or sitting around with a cup of coffee in the evening. And sometimes we will even pay online companies to dig up our family trees to find out where we came from. However it is passed down, history is important. Today, we begin looking at the section of the Bible called the history books, a collection of writings that relate the ancient history of the Israelites. For non-Jewish Christians, this may not be the history of our blood, but it is the history of our faith heritage. And that is what makes it worth knowing. Join me today as we take another step in getting to know our Bibles. I'm joined today by my oldest son, Jace. Since we are talking about history being passed down from generation to generation, I thought it would be fun to have my next generation take part in sharing about this very important section of Scripture.
Before we dig into those books, though, let's take a minute to review some of what's been discussed so far. Let's begin with the books of the Bible. We'll start with the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habbakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Now the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, Jude, and Revelation.
Thank you, Bud. Jace, the last time we were in our video lesson, we talked about the first 5 books of the Bible. Can you remember what this group of books is called?
They are the law books, or the Pentateuch.
Very good. Can you tell me in a word or two what each of these books in the law or in the Pentateuch is about?
Well, to start, Genesis is about the beginning. Exodus is about Israel leaving Egypt. Leviticus is about the priesthood and the Mosaic religion. Numbers tells us about Israel in the wilderness, and Deuteronomy means second law, where Moses repeated the law to the Israelites.
Well done. Now let's move on to the history books. Jace, which books make up this section that we call the history?
I believe it would be Joshua through Esther, which is 12 books total.
Yeah, very, very good. As we get into these books, it is important, I think, to begin with a little bit of insight about ancient history. As a genre, its technical term is historiography. So what's the difference between that and just calling it history? When someone writes a history book today, there is a general expectation that the author will stay as objective and unbiased as he possibly can. To have any sort of slant is really seen as taboo in modern history books. Ancient historiography is different in that its purpose is not to simply present facts of past events. Rather, the accounts are written to instill lessons and persuade the original readers to think and act certain ways. Now understand, this does not make them unreliable, far from it. It just means that we need to recognize that the past events that we are reading about are presented in a very specific way for specific reasons. As we examine the history books of the Old Testament, let's think for a moment what might be some of these desired outcomes for Israel, the original readers. Well, for one, the authors wanted to promote faithfulness to God, who brought them out of the land of Egypt. They also wanted to remind them of the powerful things that God had done for them in the past. Thirdly, these authors would want to teach the people about the consequences when they do depart from that faithful life. And we even find, fourthly, that some of the history books are geared toward promoting loyalty to specific leaders that God has chosen, such as King David and his dynasty. Now, listen, we realize that 12 books is a lot to cover in a single video, so here's what we're going to do to simplify this. We're going to talk about 6 major segments of history and show where these books fit into that story. And because it's so much to cover, we will split that into 2 lessons.
In total, the history books cover a very long period of time, somewhere between 800 and 1,000 years. And as before in the law books, the story is one continuous thread, picking up where the last one finished. That story can be broken down into 6 major events. The first one would be the conquering of the Promised Land. The second, a transition period. The third would be the rise of Israel's monarchy and united kingdom. The fourth one would be when the kingdom divides into 2 sections, a northern and a southern kingdom. The fifth part would be the exiles. The northern kingdom are taken by Assyria, and the southern kingdom is taken by Babylon. The sixth part is return and rebuilding. Let's start looking at these events individually.
The first segment is conquering the Promised Land. This is found in the book of Joshua. You might remember that Joshua was one of the 2 faithful spies from the book of Numbers who believed that the first generation of Israelites could have taken the land. In this book, Moses has now died, and as the new leader, it is Joshua's job to lead this new generation on the military campaign for Canaan. If you think about it, those are some pretty big shoes to fill. And that's why God takes time at the very beginning of Joshua's leadership to give him an encouraging word. Joshua chapter 1, verses 5 through 9, we find God speaking to the new leader, and he says, "No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to do according to all that the law of Moses, my servant, commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may have good success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened, and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." I think I sense a pattern there, don't you?
Be strong and courageous. It happens a couple times in there.
Yeah, just a little bit. The conquest of Canaan took about 7 years total. Upon entering the land, they started with the southern campaign and then moved up to the northern section of the land.
There are some major events worth noting in the book. Chapters 3 through 5, the people crossed the Jordan River into the land in a way that is very reminiscent of the Red Sea crossing. In chapter 6, we read perhaps the most famous story from Joshua, the Battle of Jericho, when God caused the mighty walls to come toppling down with just trumpet blasts and a shout. There were some down moments, though. At one point, a man named Achan takes some of the forbidden treasures from Jericho and brings sin into the camp, causing Israel to lose their next battle. Another time, Joshua is fooled into making an alliance with the Gibeonites, a local tribe, without consulting God to see if their story was legitimate or not. The latter half of the book is devoted to dividing the conquered land among the 12 tribes of Israel. Finally, the last couple chapters record some of the important speeches by Joshua before his death. The most well-known portion involves his final charge for the people to choose their future with God. Joshua 24, verses 14 and 15 say, "Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord."
The next section is what we will call a transitionary period, found in the books of Judges and Ruth. Now, it may be a little bit of a misnomer to describe it in this way because it lasts for about 300 years. But I call it transitionary because it marks a time when there was no real central leadership for Israel. 4 times in the book, the author mentions there was no king in Israel. It seems that the nation was more or less a loose confederation of tribes. But this is also a very dark period in their history, because the Bible also says on 2 separate occasions in the book of Judges that everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So the bulk of Judges tells about a vicious cycle that the people go through.
Apostasy.
The cycle of apostasy. It begins with sin, when the people stop worshiping God exclusively and begin to worship the pagan gods of Canaan. Once sin comes in, we have the section of servitude, where God sends another people to oppress and harass Israel, oftentimes for as long as 20 to 40 years. Then comes a section of sorrow, when the people realize their sin and they groan under the oppression that they are living through. That brings about supplication, when they finally turn back to the one true God and ask for help. This gives way to a moment of salvation, in which God sends a military leader to battle back the oppressing nation. These leaders are called judges. Most of the time, Israel remains faithful while the judge is alive. But afterwards, the next generation goes right back to the sin stage of the cycle. All told, Israel goes through this cycle of apostasy at least 8 times in the book of Judges. 2 of the more notable men in this book are Gideon, who conquered the opposing army with only 300 men, and Samson, who had long locks of hair and superhuman strength.
The book of Ruth is paired with Judges because it takes place during that time period. Ruth's story is a touching account of perseverance, love, and loyalty. Interestingly, the main character is not even an Israelite. She is a Moabitess who marries into an Israelite family. When she becomes a widow at a young age, Ruth surprisingly chooses not to go back to her blood family, but to stay with her aged widowed mother-in-law, Naomi. In a touching moment, Ruth begs Naomi, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God." Where you die, I will die, and there I shall be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." In this statement, Ruth commits to a new life. She's leaving for a new land, Israel, where she will be living in abject poverty and is vowing to leave her Moabite gods behind to worship the one God of Israel.
Upon returning to Israel, Ruth demonstrates an incredible work ethic as she takes care of her mother-in-law. She's a lady you can learn from, son. Through a series of events, she is able to find a new husband, Boaz, who is one of Naomi's relatives, thus pulling them out of poverty. Now, Ruth's story may seem like a random account, but it plays an important role in Israel's history. You see, Ruth and Boaz are the great-grandparents of David, who will become a powerful king over the people of Israel.
And that brings us to our next segment, the rise of the Jewish monarchy and the United Kingdom.
The story of Israel's kings is split among the books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. An interesting note on these books: in English Bibles, they are divided into two parts, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. However, they need to be understood as single units. The books were divided mainly because when they were originally written, they were too big to fit on a single scroll. If you were to read these books straight through, you might get a feeling of déjà vu because they tell many of the same stories. They just offer some different details and perspectives to the readers. As we've seen before, we do not know who the authors of these books are, but it is possible that Samuel wrote portions of the book that bears his name. The rest seem to have been compiled by the historians, certainly after the divided kingdom, and maybe even after the return from exile.
The book of Samuel tells of the beginning of the monarchy, but it starts with the birth of a major prophet named, you guessed it, Samuel. He is the last judge of the transitionary period and leads Israel back into a time of stronger faithfulness to God. Moreover, he is the man God uses to institute the monarchy. Unfortunately, this move is made under a bit of a cloud because the people demand to have a king in a way that is actually a rejection of God. They tell Samuel they want a king to judge them like all the other nations around them. But you need to be careful what you ask for, because sometimes you just might get it. And so God gives them the kind of king they want in a man named Saul.
Saul embodies all the traits that the people are looking for in a king. He's tall, he's young, he's handsome, and he proves to be a skilled warrior. He looks like a king. But that's not going to last very long. Saul's reign begins very well, but after several major successes, the power begins to go to his head, and his true character is revealed. He stops relying on God to strengthen him, and so God chooses someone else. This time, though, instead of the king that the people want, God chooses the king that they need, and that man is David. David is different from Saul in that he is what the Bible calls a man after God's own heart, which means he is one who trusts wholly in God to lead his life. He is secretly anointed to be king while Saul is still reigning, but it does not take long for the people to figure out this young man's future.
For starters, he has the epic battle with the giant Goliath, when Saul was cowering in his tent. That win put him on everyone's radar. After that, he quickly became a famous, successful commander in Saul's army. In fact, his popularity surpasses that of the king. People will chant in the streets, "Saul has slain his thousands, but David his 10,000s." One ironic twist is that David becomes best friends with Saul's son, Jonathan. That friendship lasts all the way until Jonathan's death in the battle at the end of 1 Samuel. Eventually, Saul's jealousy of David causes the future king to run for his life. What follows is a nearly decade-long game of cat and mouse throughout the region, Saul being the cat and David being the mouse. All the while, though, David continues to build a following of disenfranchised soldiers. But most importantly, He continues to show his reliance upon God, while Saul moves further away from the Lord. After Saul's death, and unfortunately a small civil war, David takes his place as the divinely appointed king of Israel. He reigns over Israel for 40 years, maintaining a lifetime of trust in God.
To be sure, David is not perfect. He has some rather significant blunders along the way. For one, he engages in an extramarital affair with Bathsheba and covers up the ensuing pregnancy by having her husband killed on the battlefront. As an older man, David's lackluster parenting comes back to haunt him when one of his sons attempts to steal the throne. And yet these blunders do not harm David's overall legacy, because each time he turns to God by admitting his sins and recommitting himself to walk with the Lord. A couple of other important events from David's life need to be mentioned, though. At one point in David's reign, he is struck with a sense of guilt that he is living in a great house while the Ark of God, the golden chest which represented the religious covenant, was still being housed in a tent. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, he decides that he is going to build a temple, a permanent dwelling place for God. Interestingly, despite his legacy of faithfulness, God denies David this privilege. 2 Chronicles chapter 22 verse 8 tells us that the main reason is because David was a man of war who had shed too much blood. However, God gave David something better. He promised the king that one day his children would be allowed to build that temple. Furthermore, in the same conversation, God promised to establish a Davidic dynasty that would last forever. We often call this the Davidic covenant. Centuries later, people began to recognize that this promise was being fulfilled in a spiritual way through Jesus, who is a physical descendant of David. But what about the temple?
That project was undertaken by the next king, David's son, Solomon. Solomon's reign is recorded in the books of 1 Kings and 1 Chronicles. Early in his kingship, God offered Solomon anything he wanted as a gift to honor his father David. But the young king did not ask for gold or victories, but wisdom to rule God's people properly. God granted that trait to him, as well as a massive fortune and fame. To this day, Solomon is still described by many as the wisest man to ever live. His reign was not one of war, but rather of peace and politics. Through his diplomacy, Solomon expanded the borders of Israel's kingdom to the biggest they would ever be. And Solomon did build the temple to God in Jerusalem. It was a magnificent structure. You can read all about it in 1 Kings 5 through 8.
Sadly, though, Solomon was not without his faults. Though he possessed great wisdom, he did not always use it. Through his diplomatic ventures, Solomon amassed a massive harem of 700 wives and 300 concubines. Son, that's only asking for trouble.
Way too many wives.
These women, the Bible tells us, turned his heart away from God, and he began worshiping their idol gods. As punishment for his unfaithfulness, the Lord told Solomon that the kingdom would be split apart during the time of his son. The Bible doesn't reveal what ultimately happened to Solomon's faith, but the wisdom book of Ecclesiastes suggests that he did repent and turn back to God. I personally like to believe that he had one last burst of wisdom in order to make that happen.
This is where we will stop for today. Once Solomon dies, a major shift happens in Israel's history. There's division, war, and exiles. But it is also a time of fiery prophets, incredible miracles, and the restoration of God's people. We'll talk about all that next time, though, on Getting to Know Your Bible.